Hello, welcome to Running with Eric, the show where I run around Central Park and talk about whatever comes to my mind. As you can see, we are at this corner of the park, basking in its glory. We're very close to the West End, at around like 80-something street. I don't really know. So, today I feel like talking about Les Miserables, not the musical. Look down. I feel like talking about the novel by Victor Hugo. I'm approximately 300 pages in. The Google version of the novel, which is free. If anyone wants to check it out, you can download it on a tablet. You can download it on your phone. It's worth a read. I'm about 300 pages in. What always puzzled me is that, like, the first introduction to Les Mis I had was not the novel; it was the musical. And no, not the Hugh Jackman version. I saw the online Broadway version. And what was always interesting to me was the time jumps. You know, if you don't know Les Mis, there's a prologue. The story's about a man named Jean Valjean. And Jean Valjean is a criminal who, and they explain this a lot better in the books. In the books, he is trying to raise his sister and her sister's children. The husband's dead. He's all alone. He literally is giving his life for these children, and completely miserable. He steals a loaf of bread, and normally that wouldn't, cause that much. You'd be fine, you'd probably go to prison, but it wouldn't be the end of your life. What happened with Valjean was, he was also a poacher, because, he's got to eat. So he was a poacher, and due to the political circumstances of the town that he was in, they wanted to make an example of poachers, so they gave him 5 years. And the novel explains how the reason why he got 20 was because he tried to escape 3 or 4 different times, all of which adding times to his prison sentence until you get 20 years. So he's been in jail for 20 years, he escapes, and he basically steals priests from Silver who let him into his house all willy-nilly. 1 second. So the story is a redemption story about Jean Valjean. Now, there are several different, in the musical version, there are several different time jumps. The first jump occurs when Valjean steals the silver, is caught, is returned, and what the priest does is the priest essentially forgives him. He pardons him, he tells the guards to let him go, and that's just the end of that. And then it jumps 8 or 9 years into the future, where Valjean is now a mayor. He successfully turned his life around, all is good. And then there's another time jump after Valjean is discovered, as Javert comes back, and I'll explain who Javert is in a second. He comes back, he discovers Valjean, and then Valjean's on the run. Another 10 years go by, and then we're at the Revolution, which is what most people remember the novel for, was the infamous Revolution, which was called the June Rebellion, because it really lasted for 2 days. It was more like a very, very sophisticated riot. But, Victor Hugo was living during that time, and he was also living he was basically, the reason why he wrote the novel was because France went back to an empire for a brief period of time. This was after Napoleon. It went back to an empire. Basically, the king was like, that's it, we're an empire. Victor Hugo said, people, revolt, and then he fled to the Netherlands, where that's where he started to write Les Miserables. And essentially the idea of glorifying this rebellion that only lasted for, essentially 2 days. It was it was 1 day and then into the morning of the next day. The reason why he wanted to glorify it was because he wanted to inspire the people to overthrow the emperor and to create a republic and all that good stuff. So that was really the reason why he glorified a seemingly, I don't want to say the event wasn't important, because it was, and it did mark, and you can argue as from a broader historical sense, you would definitely want to note, you would want to mention that event if you were trying to say something about the nature of the French government following the fall of Napoleon. But it's not exactly it's not like it's not like the American Civil War. It's not anywhere near the craziness of the French Revolution or anything along those lines. So in the musical, they do the same time jumps as in the novel. The difference is the novel, in place of the time jumps, so in the musical, you see Valjean give a soliloquy about how he's, oh my god, I'm such a terrible human being, because he kind of is. But the point is that he's trying to get better. So he makes his vow that he's going to become a different person, he tears up his letter, yada yada, goes away, and then the time ship happens, and you kind of figure out through context clues that, oh wait, we're in a, most people that are familiar, that like the musical, most people that go see it, know that there's a time jump. In the movie, they just say like 9 years later because they're a movie and they can get away with doing that. It'd be really awkward if you're in this gigantic, like, 100-seat theater and then you see a sign just come up from, like, the wings. It just says, 8 years later. You'd be like, really? Really? But anyway, so what strikes me out about the novel is that from the perspective of the film and the perspective of the musical, it seems like a good third or a good half of the musical is Valjean getting to Paris. Maybe not half, but a good chunk of it. But in reality, he gets to Paris like there's a lot of backstory about how he actually ends up in, he ends up in a nunnery and he ends up in a convent. And there's a lot of backstory regarding that. They don't, the event of him stepping foot in Paris occurs around page 200 out of 600, which means over half the novel is actually devoted to that final time jump. Which is fine by me, because that's the most interesting part. And even in the musical, the entire second act occurs in the final time jump, and it's about the revolution. And you're introduced to the concept of the revolution about, I would say, 2/3 of the way through Act 1. It's a really long show, and part of the problem with the show, and this is part of the problem with adapting such a novel like Les Mis, is that there's a lot of, Act 1 is huge. Act 2 actually isn't all that long, even though it's supposed to encompass the entire June Rebellion and the death of Jean Valjean and Javert and the reunion in heaven and all that good stuff. But the only reason in the show that Act 2 is so long is because of the battle sequences. If you take out the battle sequences, Act 2 is like 45 minutes, while Act 1 is like an hour and a half or more. The entire show, uncut, probably runs like 3 hours. The concert editions obviously are going to run shorter because they don't have as much in the way of scene transitions, intermissions, that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's supposed to be like a 3-hour show. It's huge. That's because it's an 80s show and they just, more is more. But anyway, it struck me very odd when I was reading the novel because I'd already been introduced to the musical. So I was like, I knew, and I'd done Wikipedia, who is this character, who is that character, and the Wikipedia does a good job at condensing the information in the novel, because in the novel you don't necessarily get the information all at once. When you're introduced to Thénardier, you're actually not introduced to Thénardier. For those who don't know, Thénardier is the innkeeper. He was played by Sacha Baron Cohen. The innkeeper is actually introduced in a section of the novel where Victor Hugo talks about the Battle of Waterloo. And he talks about basically how a certain young gentleman was trapped under a pile of bodies. Thénardier was robbing the corpses. And the guy woke up. He was like, oh crap, well, I'll move him out of the way and then make up some story about how I helped him. So he pulled the guy away after robbing him. And then the guy wakes up. He's like, oh my God, you saved my life. I'll give you all my money. Oh my goodness, my purse is gone. He's like, and then Thénardier is like, oh yeah, you must have been robbed. And it's just like, and then the guy says, what's your name? And he says, Thénardier. My name is Pontmercy. Pontmercy, Marius Pontmercy. So the person that Thénardier interacts with is actually Marius's father, who fought in the wars and whatnot. So the idea is that all these characters, it seems very odd in the musical how these characters just keep coming back. Like, the Thénardiers come back after the second time jump, and it seems very, out of place. There is a reason for that. It's because, well, in the book they make more sense. These characters are actually connected more. It's still a major, what a convenience, but it makes more sense in the novel. Victor Hugo does a very good job at taking a story that, at the simple, it's a much more simplistic story than the novel makes it. The story of Les Mis is a story of a man's redemption. But then why doesn't he call the story Jean Valjean? He calls the story Les Miserables, and the reason why he calls it Les Miserables is because it's about capturing what was happening during the time. It's not just about him, it's about, here's a guy that represents the ideal of, essentially it's what Victor Hugo is saying, that this is the ideal French citizen, and let's explore his journey and his interactions with all sorts of people. And what I love about the novel, as I'm reading it, is that there are some, nefarious characters. There are the Thénardiers. There are, Marius's granddad is a complete ass, and oh my God, it's heartbreaking what he does. Basically what he does is that, Marius's grandfather was a royalist, which meant that he sympathized with the idea of the monarchy and all that, royalty, you get the drift. Well, Marius's father was a soldier for Napoleon Bonaparte and had been granted a baron, which is like it's a significant title. Essentially, it's not exactly like getting knighted, but think of like, for the sake of an argument, just say that it's like he got knighted by the emperor, which is Napoleon. Napoleon lost, and what ended up happening is a lot of the respect for the soldiers that were received under Napoleon, because Napoleon himself was a general and he was very interested in, the soldiers, and there's great speeches by Napoleon to his soldiers, all that sort of stuff. And a lot of that fell apart, and basically what ended up happening was this, is that Marius's granddad said, hey, you give me your kid, or I'll disown you. And this is like different because it's Marius's grandfather on the mother's side, not on his dad's side. And the wife dies, and the granddad wants to take him away because he wants to raise him as a very noble royalist. And he knows that the dad will never go for that, so he says, I'll disown you, and you have no means of taking care of yourself and a kid, and you're not going to be able to leave enough money to support him. So it's very cruel and heartbreaking, and it's just like, wow, you're a nice guy. But at the same time, Victor Hugo, when Marius calls the granddad out on it after he's figured all this stuff out after being an adult, Hugo talks about how the grandfather feels like bad for it. So there's this great line where after he throws Marius out, he's like, you will never speak to him again, and then I will never speak of him again to me. And then Victor Hugo writes how the grandfather was always wishing that people would just be a little bit less respectful of that order. And I think that's nice. I think what Victor Hugo can do so brilliantly is that he can humanize people in such a way where even if they are, because it's very simplistic thinking to think in life that, well, there are good guys and there are bad guys. That's oversimplistic. Morality is not black and white. It's very complicated. What Victor Hugo does, though, is that he says, okay, yes, we'll stick with the tropes of protagonist and antagonist, but let's look at them as human beings. I'll make them sympathetic, yet I'll make sure they have enough flaws that you obviously are supposed to get that you're not supposed to sympathize with them. So Javert is fairly sympathetic, but you also get that he's his actions are very cruel, and then he has enough, he's balanced enough as a character that he is the bad guy, and you will simplistically label him the bad guy, but you also feel sorry for him. Literally, it's kind of like he was born to be an asshole. Victor Hugo describes how he has the face of a dog, like a bulldog. It's like, well, if you're born with the face of a bulldog, then, how are you supposed to get, it's kind of like if you're born with the voice of Vincent Price, you're going to be playing the bad guy in a lot of stuff, you know what I'm saying? You're just, that's how it's going to happen. So that's what I like about the novel, is that Victor Hugo can really emphasize, yes, these characters have flaws, but let's look at them as human beings. And that's really why the novel is called Les Miserables, because literally everyone in the novel is miserable. Even the bad guys. The Thénardiers are miserable. They talk about, and the musical makes this look a lot, they don't really understand, it's very hard to grasp from the musical what was going on with the Thénardiers and their inn. The Thénardiers set up an inn that was in a place that no one traveled to. They thought that what was going to happen is that what they thought is that, okay, if people are traveling from remote villages to Paris, then we can set up an inn and then we can make money off the people passing through. Sounds like a great idea. A lot of people do that. So they decided, okay, that's what we're going to do. But no one passed through the town, so they were always broke, they were always behind debts, and they basically had to resort to essentially extorting people to get ends meet, and eventually the inn would just fail. That's what happen. What you discover in the second time jump is that the inn fails, and Thénardier is never seen again until Marius runs into him. So yeah, they don't exactly explain that, Thénardier is essentially an economic failure. I mean, he's a loser, not to be mean, but just to be honest, he has economically failed in what he was trying to do. So they do make him sort of sympathetic as yes, he's a crook, but there is a backstory to how he got. It wasn't like he was just he popped out of the womb and was like, I'm going to start, robbing people. It was more like through a process he became that way. And I like that. I like novelists that can understand human beings as not necessarily as a mixture between we are this because we were born this way, and there are also processes that make us who we are. But anyway, back to the time jumps. I'm sorry, I got really off topic. So what I was going to say is that with the time jumps in Les Miserables, so they do a time jump when Valjean basically feels bad for stealing the silver, and there's some other events I don't really have to describe that what happens. He essentially accidentally robs a kid. Now, I was told by someone that, like, no, he purposely robbed him, he was just debating. No, what happened was this. So imagine, if you will, that... One sec. So imagine, if you will, that a coin rolled over, and let's say that's the coin. So a kid was playing with the coin that essentially was like our equivalent of like a $50 bill. A lot of fucking money. Probably his entire life savings. So imagine I'm sitting here. I'm Jean Valjean. I'm sad. I just robbed the priest. I see the coin. Well, sorry, I don't actually see the coin. I'm like, oh my god. And then I put my foot over the coin by accident. So I'm clearly in emotional distress. I'm not ready to be talked to. The kid runs up to me and says, sir, my sou. He's like, move your foot. And the kid's like, well, Valjean's like, kid, fuck off. Like, I'm not in the mood. So he thinks that the kid is, like, essentially, joshing him, which is understandable considering what's been going on with Jean Valjean. So basically the kid finally runs off crying, and then the guy Valjean moves his foot, and he's like, oh my god, I am a terrible human being. And he runs screaming his name, crying, trying to be like, come back, I'm sorry, until he runs across the priest, different priest this time. And he's like, do you know this kid? And the guy's like, well, based on the name, he's probably like someone from another country and you're not going to find him again. So he gives him the sou. He says, this is for your poor. He opens his own backpack and gives him more money. He says, for your poor. Then he's like, I'm a thief, arrest me. And then the priest just like runs off screaming like, oh my god. It's quite funny. Victor Hugo does have a nice sense of humor. But you feel, literally, I was almost crying when I wrote that, because it's so sad. Like, he didn't mean to rob the kid. It was just a complete accident, and it happened right after. Like, so he's like, and that really is what, that's the catalyst of, like, no, I have to be a good man. I have to be a good man. I can't keep living like this. And it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's amazing. It's why it's one of the best novels ever written. Moments like that, and there are tons of moments. Please go read the novel. I'm going to get back on track, but please go read the novel. If you have to buy it from Barnes & Noble, if you have to get it from Amazon, if you have to get the ebook, if you have to get it on your phone, whatever, it's free. If you have a tablet, there's no reason why you shouldn't read it. It's great. Please read it. Anyway, back to the whole plot story. So Valjean has that. So Valjean does that thing, and then there's the first time jump. So, sorry, there's the popo. So after the first time jump, they switch to Fantine's storyline. You know Fantine, she sings the whole I Dreamed a Dream and Time Gone By, all that sort of jazz. Who brings an incriminating letter to work and is fired. Yeah. So we're introduced to her, and basically what she does is, they explain how Cosette ended up leaving with the Thénardiers. Essentially, she was like, I can't bring this child into town, I won't get any work. And she says, I'll pay you. And it starts out really sweet, because actually Madame Thénardier is presented as a very sweet woman, and she is. And then the conversation starts turning sour the more and more that it's like, oh, well, you can more money, and you're going to send me more money. But she does. She understands. She sends them the money. And then basically the Thénardiers start spending her money on her children, and they start extorting her for more and more money, literally taking up 90% of her own income, to the point where she has to prostitute her. And they basically explain all the way... I can't remember when they stop, because basically what ends up happening is that they switch. And this is something that Victor Hugo does, and I'm not exactly it's kind of stupid. I understand why he's doing it, and I understand the style. I just get really annoyed with it. So what ends up happening is this. They introduce the town that Fantine's working in, but they don't act... This is when they've stopped with Fantine. So they've stopped, they stop talking about Fantine, and they start talking about a person that they call, Monsieur L, I think what they call him. Basically, the Monsieur of the town, which they never actually name what the town is. So you're thinking, my god, I wonder if this is Jean Valjean. Yeah, he does it a lot. He'll do that several times. He'll introduce a character where, that's clearly Jean Valjean, or that's clearly Cosette, or that's clearly, and then he'll just be like, oh, we're just going to call him something else so that I can have this big, great reveal. And it's like, okay, Hugo, we're not that stupid. Although, granted, the people that, would have been reading that... He was trying to sell this novel to all the people of France, so he was probably trying to hit the lowest common denominator. People weren't necessarily as, well-read and, understanding of, literary tropes and whatnot. Because, again, if you read a lot of novels, you start saying, I wonder... it's kind of like if you're a person that sees a lot of movies, and let's say a certain scene comes up and you're like, that seems like a scene they might try to reincorporate. It's the same thing with novels. If you read a lot of novels, you're kind of like, okay, I know what's coming, and then it comes and you're like, great, that was so useful. Thanks for wasting my, And he basically, what he does is he explains how this guy came to the town, and he did all this stuff, became the mayor and stuff, and then Javert is introduced, and Javert is like suspicious of him, that sort of stuff. So there's filler in between those time jumps. The same thing also happens when they do the final switch, the final time jump. Basically, what ends up happening is Valjean and Cosette are at the nunnery. They get into a nunnery essentially, so that they can hide from Javert. And then the second time jump happens where they introduce the character of Gavroche. They introduce the character of Marius, and I told you about how they explain their stuff, and that's where I'm at now. They've just about started finishing explaining Marius' story, and they have just hooked up Marius with Cosette and Valjean, although nothing really happened yet. Basically, Marius, like me, was just walking along the park. I'm walking along the park, and then he sees this this guy and girl that are sitting there, and he decides, oh, that girl's kind of pretty. It's kind of creepy in the sense, because it's one of those things where he's I think 20 and she was 14. Now, granted, during the time, that's fine. Way they rolled. But also the way he describes it, he was looking at her when she was 14 or 15. And then he was like, oh, she's kind of plain looking. And then 6 months later, he runs into her again, and she's like, oh my god, most beautiful woman in the world. And I'm like, really? 6 months? Really? 6 months? Not even a year? I could say a year, sexual maturity, all that sort of stuff. But, you do what you can do. But that's the point, really, with what I found interesting about the musical is that they have the time jumps, but they don't necessarily fill it in with what was in the novel. And I understand that with the musical, with the stage adaptation, you can't really do that. There's only so much time you have. But I found it interesting to read, to compare and contrast how these two adaptations, the original source material is a novel, and the musical adaptation, and then the film adaptation of the musical, try to capture what was going on in the novel from a sense of time. We could talk about, you could talk about themes, you could talk about certain little plot details, you could talk about characterizations. The musical did get a little bit of the characterization kind of but that's not really the point of the musical. The point of the musical is to capture the essence of the novel in song, which they did. If you are a fan of the novel, if you're a diehard fan of the novel, you probably won't like the musical, but if you're a diehard fan of the novel, you probably wouldn't like anything short of a 6 hour, you would need you'd get Peter Jackson. You get Peter Jackson to do 2 trilogies, one trilogy based on the first half of the novel, the second based on the second half of the novel. That is how you would please a diehard fan of the novel, because it's just so much material. It is honestly like trying to adapt Lord of the Rings. Adapt Lord of the Rings. But yeah, so that just about does it for this episode of Running with Eric, and I'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.